When people talk about the records of the 1970s, they often throw around words like warmth, texture, or character. And if you were to ask people what they thought it was that made the 70s sound so different and so unique, they'd probably say something like tape. But does tape really transform a mix that much? So let's do a little test here. Now I've got two mixes that I did. One was recorded entirely digitally, and the other one was recorded to tape. So take a listen and see if you can figure out which mix is which. So I'm super curious what you guys thought was what. The first mix was actually recorded 100% digitally, and the second mix was the one that was recorded to tape, which is interesting because when I listen to the first mix, I hear more personality, more character, and yet it was recorded digitally. The truth is, all of the traits that make that mix sound the way it does happen long before it would have actually been recorded to tape. And that's what I want to talk about today, how we can transform our mindset and our workflow to be more like that of the 1970s so that our mixes have more personality. Tape is amazing. It does do something, and we're going to talk about that, but it shouldn't be what's setting you back from achieving the mixes that you want. So I recorded that first track in 2021, and I remember I got done with a big session, and I took a step back in the room and I took this photo. And you can see there's nothing in here. I had a broken desk. I had a couple guitars, a MIDI keyboard, and a computer. That was it. You see, back then I thought if I just had a tape machine, I could just take any boring sound, throw it on tape, and it would sound amazing. But because I didn't have that, it caused me to think a little bit more outside of the box. I had to be more creative with the way that I mix. Nowadays, if I were to re-record that track, I would do things a little bit differently. And I certainly would use my tape, and I would use some of the gear that I have. But probably 99%, or let's just say 90% of what I did would stay the same because it was in the mix. It was the way that I approached the track that kind of gave it the sound. Whereas like the tape would be just sort of the glimmer on top. So back in the 70s, things were certainly not perfect. The tools were very limited. Oftentimes things had to be perfect long before you actually even started recording, because once it hit tape, it was done. And if you had to go back and make an adjustment or make a change, you were kind of out of luck. It was going to be costly. You were going to add noise. It was not an easy thing to do. So EQ levels and compression levels, all that stuff is set long before they're even recording. And the headroom was much less. So if you made any mistakes in your gain, you were going to be distorting and blowing things out. And I remember when I was listening to the Ramble On acoustic guitar track. And this acoustic guitar track is really muddy. You can find it online. It's really muddy. There's a lot of distortion. Then I realized when I was listening to more of the stems, it's like all of these tracks have just this little bit of character just baked in. And when they all come together, they create this like iconic song. They create this iconic album. Now you can't talk about the 70s without talking about the limited number of tracks. At most, you were using 24 tracks or less, which meant that every single sound had to be deliberate. You couldn't just rely on stacking a bunch of things to make up for a bad track. Now, when I was starting out, I used to do this. I used to take, let's say I was working with a pad, I would just stack a bunch of pads on top of each other until it created something that I thought was okay. So now the way I go about producing and mixing is I try to, when I'm thinking about a sound, I try to do it in as few tracks as possible. I was doing an 80s track a few months ago, and I had this synth bass, and I knew it was kind of missing something, but instead of just combining it with a bunch of other synth basses, I actually ended up using a piano to kind of thicken up the sound and it ended up sounding pretty cool. A great way we can simulate this workflow today is we can actually, instead of just bussing tracks together, we can print them together. So that way we don't go back and make unlimited adjustments. And I actually made a video not too long ago where instead of printing it into the computer, I actually bussed together a bunch of tracks straight to tape. And that's a great way to mimic that workflow, as well as just add texture and warmth to your mix. So let's talk about something like EQ. Back then, EQ curves, they were broad. You didn't have a ton of adjustments. Everything was done by ear. There was no visual feedback. And this plays a huge role in the way that things sounded. So this is a TAC M30. It's an old analog mixer. Now, some old school analog mixers, you'd see like 2 EQ knobs. It would be like a low shelf and a high shelf. So in an example like that, if I wanted to scoop the mids, I might find myself boosting the low shelf and the high shelf. And then as a result, relative to those frequencies, the mids would seem scooped. So there's a lot of creative ways that you can go about mixing, even with limitations. But in this example, I've got 3 knobs. Now these first 2, we can adjust the frequency, and then the top knob here, we can actually adjust the gain. So this one goes from 60 Hertz to 1.5K. This one goes from 1K to 10K. And then the top is a 12.5K shelf. And then as it's recording through here, it's going to be printing, so there will be no going back. So it'll be interesting to see that workflow. Nowadays, engineers have the ability to endlessly EQ. We can surgically EQ, we can dynamically EQ, and we can basically take anything and make it sound perfect. But if we go back to that Zeppelin 2 track, if that was recorded today, the track would end up being much cleaner. There wouldn't be all the distortion and imperfections in it. But it's actually those imperfections that give it the character, that give it the warmth, and the texture that we all know and love. One of the most important topics that you have to talk about when trying to achieve the sounds of the 1970s is commitment. You see, nowadays we have unlimited redos. We can edit to our heart's content. We can punch in, we have unlimited tracks. But back then, things like EQ, compression, or effects, those things were printed very early on, and you couldn't actually go back and make adjustments easily. And today with those endless revisions, you often find yourself second guessing, going back, feeling unsatisfied, whereas if I was to just commit to something, I look at it like it's done, it's time to move on to the next. If there's one thing I would say, the biggest benefit to having analog stuff in your workflow is the way that it forces you to commit. So with all that being said, I want to show you guys how we can actually implement some of these things into our workflow to help better simulate that of the 1970s. Okay, so as I was saying before, we have the ability to make unlimited adjustments nowadays when it comes to EQ. And this is great, but if we want to train ourselves to be better with EQ, if we want to work on our ears, I highly recommend using something like this. Now this is Artoria's replication of a Neve 1073. There's a bunch of free things that simulate this as well. This is Logic's version. These two things do the exact same thing. So don't feel like you have to actually pay money to do this. We're just trying to limit the amount of adjustments that we can make when it comes to EQ. Not only that, but we are training our ears because there is no visual feedback when we're making these adjustments. If you can get good at doing something like this, you will be that much better when you come back to EQs like this. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to go to the output of our instrument and switch that to a bus. Now here I'm using bus 10, then I'm going to create an audio track and select the input on that audio track to also be bus 10. Then we want to arm the audio track. I'm also going to mute it so we don't have to hear both. And when I press record, every adjustment that I make will be recorded to this audio track in real time. So if you want your music to sound warm and have character, stop with the endless edits. Don't overproduce your tracks. Instead, focus on the playing, the sounds that you're creating. Most importantly, the creative stuff. Tape is a beautiful thing. It does add character, but the most important thing that tape is going to add is the way that it changes your workflow. At some point, I'd love to take you guys along the ride. As we produce something, you can kind of see all of these ideas being implemented in real time. If that's something you'd like to see, let me know down below and maybe we'll do something like that. But hopefully this kind of inspires at least one person out there that feels maybe like their setup is limiting themselves. I know when I was in that position, I felt like it was just a negative, but I look back on it now and I think those limitations really did add a lot to the way that I mix and produce now. You can do a lot these days with very, very little. So don't let your limitations stop you from creating the art that you want to create.